We're honored to have him speak here at this conference today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Governor Jindal.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much for that very warm reception. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I know it has been said already, but I want to add my voice to those. I want to echo the many nice things that have been said about Susanna. This is our second trip to your great state of New Mexico. My first trip was here to help her during her campaign. I've just got to tell you, on behalf of other governors across the country, we are so impressed with your new governor. Let's give her another round of applause for her great leadership. I want to thank Wayne and Norm and Fred and so many of my other friends that have been such active leaders in putting this conference together. I was thrilled when they asked me to come and talk about education. You know, I want to start. My wife is here with me, and we are just proud parents of 3 great children who are right now at home staying with the grandparents, which means they're eating as much ice cream as they want and they're doing whatever they want. We've got a little girl that's 9, a little boy that's 7, and our youngest is a little 5-year-old boy. You know, it's an amazing thing. When you have children, it's amazing how many things change in your lives. One of the things I've noticed is how many things change in your parents' lives as well. I noticed with the birth of our first child, because both my wife and I are the oldest in our families, so our first child, our daughter, was the first grandchild on both sides. The first thing I noticed was that the transformation in our parents. My dad in particular, he became both smarter and nicer once he had a grandchild. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, first, the smarter part. You know, I'm going to paraphrase Mark Twain. He said, it's amazing how much smarter your parents become the older you get. And it is true. All the things that made you just roll your eyes and frustrated when you were a child, you begin to appreciate when you have your own children. You appreciate, I'm going to come back to that. But it has also made my dad a much nicer person. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, don't get me wrong, I love my parents. But growing up, just to give you an idea, I had some of the strictest parents you'll meet anywhere in the world. I remember one day I got this great idea. I came home and told my dad. I said, Dad, you know, all my friends at school, they get an allowance. They do all these chores. They get paid for the chores they do. I've noticed I do a lot of chores. I don't get paid. I think it'd be a good idea for me to start getting an allowance if you want me to continue to do my chores. That was a mistake, let me tell you. I was expecting an allowance. Instead, my dad said to me, he said, son, how much do you reckon you should pay me for all the food you eat, for the clothes you wear, the roof I put on top of your head every day? By the time he was done with his calculations, I was going to owe him money instead of getting paid an allowance. I never got paid an allowance. What I did get from my father was a lot of lectures. You know, whenever I'd come home and complain about something, he would tell me, son, you don't know how lucky you are. Because apparently when he was growing up, he had to walk uphill to get to school. And apparently at the end of the day, they had to walk uphill to get home from school too. They were so poor, they didn't have school buses, they didn't have downhill when he was growing up. But it is amazing. He gets a grandchild, and all of a sudden there's like a gene that gets turned off. I realized this. My little boy, the 7-year-old, he's at that age where he's losing his baby teeth. His teeth are loose every couple of weeks, and one day he comes home and he says, Daddy, I've got a loose tooth. He says, I've got to go spend the night at Grandma and Poppy's house. I said, why do you have to go spend the night there? He said, well, when I spend the night there, the tooth fairy brings a lot more money at their house than at your house. I've got to go there. This same man that wouldn't give me an allowance will give his grandchildren anything they want. But you know, as I reflect back, I also realize how much smarter he is and always was than I ever gave him credit for. I now begin to appreciate his life experiences. I've had the privilege of working for a president of the United States. I've had the privilege of working for a United States Senator and for some of the largest companies in our country. And yet when I'm asked who my heroes are, who my role models are, I always answer my parents. And I really now begin to appreciate what they went through. My dad was one of those proverbial, we've all heard the stories. He literally did grow up in a house without electricity, without running water. My dad's one of 9 children. Middle child, and he had parents who didn't speak English. He was the only child that got past the 5th grade. And I think about that. None of the younger siblings, none of the older siblings went to school. He was the only one that got any kind of education. And his parents, my grandparents' priorities were that he had to work first. Some days he couldn't go to school. If the family needed him to work to help pay the bills, he couldn't go to school. He was only allowed to go to school when it was affordable for him to do so. And yet he struggled to create a better life for himself. You know, my grandparents were barely, I'm not even sure they were literate at all. Barely literate, it's not even fair. And yet they allowed him, and they, in their own way, encouraged him. He went on to get a college education. He went on to become an engineer. And now when you think about when he had achieved what probably was his wildest dreams, married my mother, they were expecting me, their first child, and all of a sudden they pick up and move halfway across the world to this new country, to America. And I can only imagine, you've got this young couple expecting their first child. They don't know anybody in America. This was before the days of the internet and cell phones, and those were the days when long-distance calls were so expensive, you couldn't call overseas to find news or to catch up with family. They didn't know anybody living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My mom had been given an opportunity to come do some studies or graduate work at LSU. They turned down the first opportunity. So, well, this doesn't really make sense. We're pregnant. We're expecting our first child. You know, we'll see if maybe later, but right now it doesn't make sense. My dad had a great job. LSU came back and said, look, we want you to come so badly. If you come, we'll give you a month off, a month vacation off in summer when your baby is born. That was such a generous offer. Nobody did that back then that my parents decided to come. Packed up what they could. They didn't have any money. They had very few belongings. They arrived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They didn't know anybody. Now, somebody hadn't explained to them how health insurance worked in our country at that time. I was politely what you would call a pre-existing condition. Now, before you get the wrong idea, they were married. I don't mean I predated the marriage. But LSU hadn't told them that I wouldn't be covered under their insurance plan. My parents didn't have a lot of money, so when they went to the doctor, or they went to the hospital, my dad literally shook hands with the doctor. The insurance didn't cover my birth, so my dad said, I'll pay you every month until I pay the bill off. And that's basically what they did. I asked my dad when I was old enough to understand this, I said, how do you pay for a baby on installment? I mean, if you miss a payment, can they take the baby back? I mean, what do they do? How do you enforce that? He said, son, if they would have taken you back, we would have given you back. Trust me, we'd have missed a payment. He said, you were a lot of trouble when you were a child. There's no paperwork. There were no forms. Ironically, 2 of my 3 children were born at that same hospital where I was born many, many years later. We had good insurance. It took us hours to fill out the paperwork. It was a lot more complicated when our children were born. Back in my parents' day, they literally just shook a hand. They just shook hands with the doctor. And what I love is they arrived in this country. They didn't have a car. They didn't have an apartment. They didn't have any money in their pockets. But they knew that they could succeed here. My mom started her studies. My dad, now you think about it, he doesn't know anybody. So he picks up the phone book, picks up the yellow pages, and starts calling company after company with nothing but the confidence that he could get a job in this great country. Eventually, after he calls through several of these pages, finally somebody offers him a job on the phone, sight unseen. I can only imagine my dad's confidence. He says to this man, well, that's great. He says, I don't have a car. I don't have a driver's license. How are you going to get me to work? And to his surprise, the man was so taken aback by my dad's confidence, he said, I'll have one of my employees come pick you up. And that's exactly what he did. And brought him to work, and my dad got his first job and was able to pay his bills. This is why I'm beginning to appreciate now as a father. And I didn't appreciate this as a son. When my parents talked about what makes America so great, I didn't really appreciate that. You know, when your parents tell you things like, you better eat your vegetables. When I was a little boy, they'd say, there's starving children in China, you better eat your vegetables. I said, well, send them my vegetables. I don't want them. I mean, what does that have to do with me? I don't understand why that means I've got to eat vegetables I don't want to eat. Or my dad would tell me every day, every single day, you are so lucky you're an American. You know, to a child, though, what does that mean? I didn't have a choice. I was born here, and what else would I be? Of course I'm an American. All my friends are Americans. What else would I be? But one of the things I really didn't appreciate was the unconditional love our parents gave us. And what do I mean by that? You know, there's a story, and I don't know if it's true or not, but there's a story about Bobby Kennedy, that he went home one day and told his father, Joe Kennedy, that he didn't want to go into the family business. Joe famously wanted his sons to be presidents of the United States. Bobby came home one day and said, Dad, I don't want to go into politics. He said, instead, I want to become a Catholic priest. Joe Kennedy apparently didn't miss a beat. When he heard this, he said, son, that would be great. He said, we've never had a pope in the Kennedy family before. It'd be good to have one of those. That was my father. That was my father. My father, if you brought home a test, if you brought home a 95, you want to know why you didn't get 100. And if you brought him 100, you want to know why you didn't do better than that. And you'd better not go home and tell them, well, the other kids didn't do well. The other kids, the average grade was only an 80, because then you would always hear this. I heard this so many times I could almost say it before he said it. If all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? I had no idea what that meant as a child. I said, what does that have to do with getting a 95 on my test? But you know, it's only later that I realized that unconditional love also gave me great confidence. If my dad loved me so much and believed in me so much, if my dad had that kind of confidence to give up everything and start all over because he believed this was the greatest country in the entire world, and he believed there was no limit on what you could achieve in this country. If you try to come home and give him an excuse, he would throw it away. If you try to come home and say, well, my teacher doesn't like me, my teacher's not fair, he didn't want to hear it. He'd say, well, work harder and do better. And it was hard to complain when you looked at his life example. It was hard to go to him and say, well, life's not fair to me, because you knew what he had been through. One of the things my dad has always been passionate about is education. He was determined his children would get a great education. He would tell us. He'd say, sons, look, I may not leave you an inheritance or a famous name, but I'm going to get you a great education. And he was so confident that with education, with hard work, we could do whatever we wanted in this country, this land of opportunity. He was confident if he got us that great foundation, that education, along with the work ethic and the values and the other things parents give their children, that there was no limit to what we could accomplish. He thought that was much more important than an inheritance or any kind of money or any kind of other legacy. And so now, as governor of the great state of Louisiana, one of my primary goals is to make sure that every child has a great education. Because it is so important. If we want to leave behind the American dream to our children that our parents left to us, we have to make sure they've got the education, the skills, the tools they'll need. Now, I could talk about a lot of things Louisiana's done. We have cut taxes. We're not raising taxes as long as I'm governor. We've cut spending. We've set priorities. And our economy is doing better than the South, better than the national economy. But I also believe in the modern economy. The families, the states, the countries that want to compete and succeed have to have the best, most skilled, most educated, most productive people. It is great to have low taxes and natural resources and strong ethics laws and invest in infrastructure, but without education, it is impossible to compete in today's economy. So I want to share with you just briefly what we are doing in the state of Louisiana. Like New Mexico, we have got a public education system that historically has not done very well compared to other states. Now, my wife and I both graduated from public schools in Louisiana. You can get a great education. You can get a great education in our state and all across our state, in rural and urban school districts. But it's also fair to say that we have not done as well historically as many other states, and we owe our children even better. You know, in K-12 education, I want to highlight 6 things that we have done that I think are absolutely critical to transforming our educational system. And they're pretty commonsensical and pretty simple. But when you try to make big changes, you will run into folks who want to protect the status quo. The first, we passed a bill called the Value Added Assessment Act. What does this mean? You know, since I've been governor, we've cut spending across state government 26%, $9 billion. Fewest number of state employees we've had in over 20 years. But we have not cut the MFP, the funding formula for K-12 education. We've increased K-12 education funding by $200 million. We gave teachers a pay raise my first year, got them to the Southern average. And yet today, when I come talk about education, I'm not here to talk about more dollars or more inputs. I want to talk about outcomes. For too many years, progress in education was measured by how many dollars we spent, not how much our students were learning. So the first thing, one of the first and most important things we can do is pass this bill called the Value Added Assessment Act. Now, why is this so important? What we're basically saying is we're going to measure the students at the beginning of the school year, at the end of the school year. And we're going to see how they do in each classroom. And then we're going to evaluate our teachers, and 50% will be directly based on the objective measurements of how their students did at the beginning of the year towards the end of the year. And that way you can reward teachers who go into harder to teach environments, harder to teach subjects. And so often teachers complain, well, if I start with kids that are below grade level, I get no recognition for getting them to grade level or above grade level. And that's exactly right. But it also allows you to influence policies like tenure policies, compensation policies, promotion policies. For too many school systems, it's, last in, first out. Everything's done based on seniority. There's not a business person here who runs their business purely based on seniority. It just makes sense you would want to reward, encourage, and motivate your best teachers, and then help those teachers who are not doing as well in the classroom, giving them the training they need, and also making sure that you only keep the best teachers in your classrooms. So the first thing, it's pretty simple from a business perspective, is we're measuring what's going on in our classrooms, and then we're going to reward our teachers based on what's going on. Now, again, there are people that don't like change. The unions came to the state school board and said, we don't like this emphasis on student performance. I can't think of a more ridiculous statement to make for a group that is supposed to be representing. And by the way, I'm going to talk about teacher unions and a lot of these reforms. I'm not talking about teachers who are on the front lines in the trenches. We've got some great teachers in Louisiana, and every one of us can remember teachers who made a difference in our childhood, in our lives. I'm not talking about teachers. I'm talking about unions that sometimes don't represent the interest of their own members. And so on this first point, they're fighting at the state school board level saying, and literally saying to the public, we don't know that student achievement should be such a big part of measuring teacher effectiveness. I think that's so absurd it doesn't even deserve a refutation, but the first thing we're doing is measuring student performance and tying that to how we reward, hire, and keep our teachers. The second thing we've done, and Louisiana's gotten a lot of national attention for the promotion of charter schools. And a lot of that has to do with what happened right after Hurricane Katrina. You know, a lot of people have looked at what's happened in the city of New Orleans and said, because of what happened after Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans has had an opportunity to rebuild and improve their schools, but I want to be very clear on something. 2 points before I get into the charter schools. Number one, New Orleans' public schools were an abysmal failure before Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina didn't cause all of those challenges. Secondly, I think it's a little too glib to say there's a silver lining around a storm that killed over 1,000 people, caused over $100 billion of property damage. Nobody in their right minds would have asked for or wished for this storm. So I think it's always important to remember the damage this storm caused in this community. But having said that, I want to just give you one anecdote. I could give you story after story. We could talk about the dozens of federal cases being made against the adults who are stealing money and corrupting the New Orleans public school system. We could talk about schools that were plagued with violence, that couldn't even keep clean toilet paper in the bathrooms for the children, couldn't keep basic supplies on the shelves, despite spending more per student than many other school districts in the state. An AP reporter called it one of the worst public school systems, among the worst public school systems in the entire country. But here's just one anecdote to tell you how bad it was. There was a little girl that was a valedictorian of her public high school in New Orleans, graduated with a perfect 4.0. She took the ACT, National Standardized College Test. She scored an 11 on the ACT. I'm here to tell you that is an embarrassment. I'm here to tell you that that school didn't serve either her or her family very well. Now, she's getting A's, she's getting a 4.0 all along, and she only gets an 11 on the ACT. This is the valedictorian of a high school in New Orleans before Katrina. After Katrina, what happened? After Katrina, the state decided to put the schools not under the control of the same old school board that had caused the problems, but under the state-run recovery school district. After the storms, the state decided to do away with the collective bargaining contract that had been there before, and after the storms, 70% of the students in New Orleans were now enrolled in public charter schools. The reality is today, New Orleans has got a majority of its students are in charter schools. We've got the highest percentage of our students in charter schools. I want to give you a couple of examples of how those charter schools are doing. KIPP now has over 1,000 students in charter schools, one of the nationally recognized groups in the city of New Orleans. Sophie Wright Charter is an example of a charter school. Before Katrina, 83% of their students were scoring below basic. 83%. After Katrina, 62% of their 8th graders passed the state-mandated LEAP test. Now, people will try to tell you it takes a lifetime to change education. We need to make incremental progress. I'm here to tell you that's nonsense. Our children only grow up once. They only have one chance to get a great education. It is nonsense to tell them, just wait, we might fix this in 20 to 30 years. When we look at Sophie Wright Charter, it didn't take them 20 or 30 years. In a very short period of time, they went from 83% below basic, 62% passing. They interviewed the principal, and they asked her, what would you do if they revoked your charter and put your school back under the traditional public school system, back under the regular bureaucracy? She literally said she would find another profession. She said if her school was not a charter school, this is one of the most successful turnaround leaders in public education in New Orleans, she said she would leave if her school was no longer a charter school. Stanford did a study that just came out last week showing that Louisiana's charter schools are outperforming on both math and science, and now we're building on that success. We've got some of the best charter laws in our state, and I won't go through all the things we've done to lift the caps and empower good operators. We've got 2 virtual charter schools. But here's the important thing. Not every charter school is made the same. I'm not here to tell you charter schools are a silver bullet. I'm simply here to say that we've got to give our parents more options so they can get the best education for their children. The number of unacceptable schools has been decreased by 22% in just 1 year. But if you look back over the last 5 years, we've decreased the number of unacceptable schools by 75%. So what that shows is you can make real and significant change, and it doesn't take a lifetime if you're willing to make aggressive reforms. The third thing I want to mention, and now remember, I'm not saying charter schools are the answer for every problem, but I'm saying more choice, more competition is, and that's why the third thing we did. We created a scholarship program, state-funded program so parents can send their kids to, whether it's Christian schools, private schools, parochial schools, other high-performing schools. I want to share with you the story, and we've also done other things. We've also increased the tax deductibility to make it more affordable for parents to make these kinds of choices. I want to share with you the story of a young student. There was a 6th grader named Gabriel who was on a very different path if it wasn't for his state-provided scholarship to attend a private Catholic school in New Orleans. At age 10 now, Gabriel is happy, well-adjusted. He's on track to enter a college prep high school and then college. But a few years ago, when his family returned to New Orleans after the storm, he was behind academically. He was being bullied in his New Orleans public school. He was just plain miserable. This is what his mother said. He used to cry not to go to school. In 2008, his mother found out about the scholarship program when a volunteer knocked on her door to tell her about the option for Gabriel. She eagerly applied. She got Gabriel a spot at Resurrection of Our Lord Elementary in the 3rd grade. His mom says this: I couldn't send him back to that dangerous environment he had been in where he wasn't catching up academically and he was coming home crying. Gabriel's mom said she saw an immediate improvement in her son personally and academically. She said every parent deserves the choice of a better school. I can't say it better than Gabriel's mom. When we try to introduce choice into education, you hear all kinds of ideological arguments. It's not about the adults in the educational system. It needs to be about the children. Somebody needs to be able to look at Gabriel's mom and tell her why it's wrong that her child finally has a chance to get a great education. She's exactly right. Every parent deserves the choice of a better school for their child. The fourth thing we've done. You know, Louisiana has long won national awards for our accountability system, and it's a great system. Once a year in the newspapers, they print out all the scores for the different schools. They get stars, they get minimum growth scores. The problem is it's so confusing, it's hard to make heads or tails of it. You know, my kids, they get letter grades. You come home on a report card, it says A, you know your child's done pretty well. They're bringing home D's and F's, you know they're not doing pretty. It's pretty simple. It's not real complicated. So we passed a law called the letter grade law where we're giving every school in the state, every public school in the state of Louisiana a letter grade based on how well their students are doing. It goes into effect this month, literally in September and October, parents will be getting letter grades for their schools. Now, the unions, again, didn't like this. They went to the school board and said, well, we think the grade shouldn't just be based on student achievement, but why not on effort? Or why not give us a higher letter grade if we're trying harder, if we made a little bit of an improvement? Well, that defeats the whole purpose. If you're a parent, you don't want to know about effort, and you don't want to know if they're trying to improve the school. You want to know, bottom line, is my child going to a school that's getting an A grade or not? Are they learning? Or if not, I need to be demanding. If the parents of the little girl, the valedictorian who got the 11 on their ACT, if they had known earlier, maybe they could have done something to improve their child's education. The fifth bill that we passed was the Red Tape Reduction Act. You know, the unions came to me and they complained to me. They said, Governor, it's not fair. The charter schools, they've got all this flexibility. They don't have the same red tape. They don't have the same bureaucracy we've got. You're comparing apples to oranges. It's not fair. I said, you know what, that's fair. That's a fair criticism. I said, we should level the playing field. I passed the Red Tape Reduction Act to say public schools should be able to eliminate the bureaucracy and red tape in their schools as well. Now, the teachers were concerned, so we said, all right, it'll take a majority vote of the teachers to eliminate the red tape. Now, how does this work? So, for example, if you want to have a longer school day, school week, if you want to have a longer school year, if you want to spend more time on reading, because that's what your students need, if you have a great teacher and you want to put more children in her classroom because she's doing a really good job, instead of having to go to the State Department of Education, this allows the school to do that as long as they can show that students are learning. So I listened to teacher unions, I passed this bill, and you would have thought they would have rushed out to go and get rid of the red tape, the bureaucracy that's preventing them from teaching our children. They sued me in state court. They said it wasn't constitutional to cut the same red tape and bureaucracy they've been complaining about all these years. So I said, now wait a minute, do you really want me to get rid of the red tape and bureaucracy, or is this just an excuse? We try to call their bluff to say, if you really want us to cut through the red tape, this is the most effective way to do it. The sixth and final point I want to make about K through 12 education, we passed a bill called the Teachers' Bill of Rights. You know, I told you we increased teacher compensation, but when we survey teachers, the number one reason we lose good teachers in the state of Louisiana, the number one reason they're leaving our classrooms, it's not compensation. It's the environment in the classroom. It's a lack of discipline. You know, if you don't believe me, go visit a classroom. It's not like what you and I remember when we were children. Remember my dad? Remember I told you he got nicer when he became a grandfather? When I was a child, when I'd get in trouble in school, I would beg the teachers, do whatever you want, just don't tell my parents what I did. My dad had a funny sense of justice. Because when I got home, if the teacher sent a note or called my dad, you knew I was going to get spanked when he got home. And if you try to tell my dad, well, Dad, I didn't do what the teacher said, he'd say, son, I know you better than that. You may not have done what she said, but I'm sure you got away with something today. He said, so I'm spanking you for that, and we'll just call it even. Don't worry about it. It's not like that today. It's not like that today. Today, teachers will tell you the parents come and yell at them. And that's why we enacted a Teachers' Bill of Rights to make it clear our teachers have the right to maintain discipline in their classrooms. I will tell you, our youngest boy, when he was going to kindergarten, our middle child, when he was going to kindergarten, they gave him little colors, like if you behaved, you got a green card, you misbehaved, you got a red card, in between was a yellow. It was pretty tough to get a green card, so the teacher said, look, if you get 5 green cards in a row, you're going to get a prize. First day, my little boy comes home, he brings a yellow card home. I said, Sean, we can do better than this. Why didn't you bring home a green card? What'd you do in school today? He said, Daddy, my teacher doesn't give green cards. She only gives yellow. I said, son, Daddy wasn't born yesterday. I know she gives a green card. Nice try. But I said, look, if you work really hard, I bet you could get a green card. So the next day, he promises he'll try. The next day, he comes home, he brings home a green card. I was so proud of him. I said, Sean, look, if you work hard, you bring home 5 green cards in a row. Now, that's a lot of work. Not only will you get a prize at school, Mommy and Daddy will take you to the toy store, we'll buy you a toy, just because I want you to start the school year right. I love my little boy. He climbs up to my lap, gives me a big hug. He goes, Daddy, I don't think I'm going to be able to bring another green card home all year long. He had done the calculation. He decided that was just way too much work. He wasn't going to do it. It wasn't worth the toy. He was happy with yellow. These 6 reforms are what we are doing in Louisiana, among other things. But the value-added assessment, the charter schools, the scholarship, the tax deduction programs, letter grade for our schools, Red Tape Reduction Act, Teachers' Bill of Rights. I want to talk to you just a minute about higher education before I close. We're doing the same thing in higher education. I was the president of the University of Louisiana system. In Louisiana, we rank among the top states in the percentage of our economy and tax dollars we spend on higher education. Yet for years, our results have lagged other states. And the problem was we were paying for activity, not results. Something like 75% of our kids were starting in 4-year colleges. In other states, like California, 75% started in community colleges. In the South, the average was 50-50. Here was the problem. We were spending all this money. We had the second lowest graduation rates in the entire South. You know, when kids are dropping out, it's not good for them. They've got debt, but it's not good for the state. We're wasting tax dollars. It's not good for the economy. And we figured out we were paying colleges according to the wrong things. We were paying them to be big, so they got bigger and bigger. They enrolled students before they were ready without determining whether they belonged on that campus or a different campus. We passed a Grad Act and a Grad Act 2.0, and I won't go through all the details. It was pretty simple. We told the schools, the universities in our state, we're going to pay you based on results. That's retention rates, that's graduation rates, that's R&D activity, that's your linkage to the community producing the kinds of workers they need. We offer a day one guarantee that says our people will be ready to work on the first day, or our technical and community colleges will retrain them for free. That's how confident we are that we're going to fix our higher education system and align it with the needs of our employers and our workforce and our students. There's a lot of protests that you can't do that in higher education, but you have to do that. In the same way we're reforming K-12, we're also reforming higher education as well, and we're making great progress. Retention and graduation rates are increasing. Now, the reason this is all so important, the reason I was asked to come talk about education is, if we want our children to have great careers, if we want our states to have stronger economies, if we want our country to grow again, it is so important that we make sure that every child gets a great education. 70% of the employers that want to move or expand in Louisiana tell us one of their top 2 concerns is finding a skilled worker. And I could talk to you about a number of statistics showing that Louisiana is now the #1 state in the South 3 years in a row for economic development, according to Southern Business Report. Our unemployment rate has been below the national and Southern averages every single month since I've been governor, and after 25 years of exporting our children. We've now had 4 years in a row where more people are moving into our state. But the most important legacy we can leave behind, not only as elected leaders, as community leaders, but as parents, is to make sure that we don't become the first generation that leaves behind fewer opportunities for our children than we inherited from our parents. And I started by talking about my dad. I want to close by talking about my dad. My dad has never asked for anything from either of his boys. He has never asked us to pay him back for the money he spent on our college education. He's never asked us to commit that we would take care of him as he got older, though we would certainly do all those things. But this is the one thing he's asked us to do. He said, I made sure you could get a great education and do even better than your mom and I did professionally. He says, now it's your obligation to do that for my grandchildren. You need to make sure they get a great education and they have more opportunities, they do better than you did. And that is the obligation we all have as Americans, to make sure we don't leave our children so much drowning in debt without the jobs and the opportunities they need to get ahead. My father, my mom came halfway across the world because they knew with hard work and a great education, there was no limit on what you could accomplish in this great country. I'm committed to the preservation of that American dream for our children and grandchildren, and it starts by making sure we ensure that they get a great education. God bless y'all, and thank y'all very much for allowing me to come speak to y'all today.
God bless you, Governor. Wow. Wow.